The narrow mountain road twisted sharply, vanishing into patches of heavy morning fog. Clara held her small leather bag against her chest, her fingers numb from the cold air seeping through the cracked carriage window. The driver, an older man with a gray wool cap pulled low, said nothing as the hospice finally came into view. A dark, rectangular building perched alone on a ridge, its windows like empty eyes staring down the valley. When the carriage stopped, Clara stepped out cautiously, her boots sinking into wet gravel. A single lantern flickered near the entrance, illuminating a heavy wooden door. Before she could adjust her coat, the door creaked open, and a tall man appeared. He was dressed in a long black buttoned coat, his silver hair slicked back severely. His face was sharp, almost sculpted, and his eyes fixed on her without a hint of warmth. He didn't offer his hand or speak. Clara felt her breath catch. She lowered her gaze immediately. The driver placed her bag on the ground and turned back without a word, the carriage wheels crunching away into the fog, leaving only the echo behind. Clara watched it disappear, feeling the ground shift under her feet as the realization crept in. She was utterly alone now. The man stepped forward and picked up her bag as if it weighed nothing. He motioned sharply for her to follow. She obeyed, her shoes slipping slightly on the damp stones. Inside, the hallway smelled of cold wood and something faintly medicinal. Oil lamps cast long, wavering shadows on the walls where old portraits of severe-looking figures lined up like silent judges. Clara's heart hammered as she walked behind him. She tried to match his steps, careful not to make a sound. At the far end of the hall, a narrow staircase led up to the second floor. He paused there, turning to her finally. His eyes traveled over her face, down to her trembling hands. "You are to stay quiet," he said, voice low and cutting. "You do as you're told. You do not wander. You do not speak to the patients. You do not ask questions." Each word felt like a nail being driven into her spine. She swallowed, nodding quickly. Without another glance, he turned and began to climb the stairs. Clara hesitated at the foot of them, her breath shallow, her fingers still gripping the thin handle of her bag. She felt the walls leaning closer, the portraits watching her silently. Behind her, the door slammed shut, echoing through the corridor like a final verdict. Clara forced her legs to move, following the man up into the unknown, every step heavier than the last. Clara's room was small and cold, barely wider than the narrow bed pushed up against the wall. A single iron basin sat beneath the barred window which faced a steep slope covered in wet black pines. The air inside smelled faintly of mold and old linen. She set her bag on the bed, her hands shaking as she unfastened the worn clasp. Before she could unpack, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Mr. Falk appeared at her door, his silhouette filling the entire frame. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. "You will rise before dawn," he said, his voice low and dry as dust. "You will clean the hallways and help in the kitchen. No questions, no wandering." He paused, his eyes sweeping over her small pile of clothes, the thin gray dress she wore, the slight tremor in her fingers. Clara nodded quickly, her throat too tight to speak. He turned his head sharply toward the window. "You see that forest? It's dangerous. Fog comes in fast and the paths disappear. If you try to leave, you won't return." His words hung in the air like smoke. Clara pressed her lips together, her mind spinning. The image of the forest swallowing her felt more real than any threat he could make. Mr. Falk stepped closer. For a moment she could feel his breath. "Understand?" "Yes," she forced out, her voice no louder than a whisper. He watched her for a long second, then turned and left. The door clicked shut with a soft finality. Clara dropped to the edge of the bed, her hands buried in the fabric of her skirt. She felt the walls press in around her. Every sound in the corridor, the creak of wood, the whisper of passing footsteps, seemed amplified. She stared at the window, the thick fog outside swallowing the last traces of daylight. Slowly she began to unpack her things. A single wool scarf, 2 thin blouses, a small tin comb, and a folded letter she had hidden at the bottom of her bag. The letter was from her aunt, written in hurried, slanted handwriting. It warned her to obey, to stay silent, to survive. Clara pressed the letter to her chest, her fingers trembling. Her eyes burned, but no tears came. She slipped the letter under her pillow, then curled up on the bed, pulling her thin blanket around her shoulders. As the night settled and the hospice fell silent, Clara lay awake, listening to her own shallow breaths, knowing this was only the beginning. Clara woke before the first light, the room still swallowed in heavy darkness. Her fingers were stiff and numb when she reached for the cold basin to splash water on her face. Every sound seemed to echo: the dripping water, the soft rustle of her dress as she dressed in the thin gray fabric again. Outside her room, the corridor felt even colder. Shadows clung to the corners, and the portraits on the walls seemed to watch her as she moved. She kept her head down, stepping lightly to avoid making noise. In the kitchen, a woman stood with her back to Clara. She was older, her hair tied tightly under a dark scarf, hands moving rhythmically over a pile of root vegetables. A large iron pot simmered on a small stove, filling the air with a faint, earthy smell. The woman did not turn or speak when Clara entered. Unsure, Clara hovered near the door until the woman gestured sharply without looking up. Clara stepped forward, her heart pounding. The woman handed her a small knife and pointed to a crate of potatoes. They worked in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of the knife and the distant creak of the house settling. Clara glanced at the woman's hands, thin, veined, moving with practiced precision. Each movement felt tense, almost fearful. After what felt like an hour, a door opened behind them. Clara froze, her knife slipping slightly. Mr. Falk's footsteps crossed the kitchen floor, slow and deliberate. He stopped next to the pot, lifted the lid, and breathed in the steam. Without looking at either of them, he spoke. "You will serve the morning meal in the East Hall. Do not speak to anyone." Clara nodded quickly, her eyes fixed on the table. The woman only kept cutting, her face lowered even further. Mr. Falk lingered for a moment longer, his presence filling the room like a heavy fog. Then he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. When he was gone, Clara risked a glance at the woman. For a brief second their eyes met. The woman's gaze was hollow, tired, carrying a warning Clara couldn't fully understand yet. A sudden clatter from the hallway snapped their attention away. The woman jerked her head toward the pot and then at the tray beside it. Clara moved quickly, assembling simple bowls of thin porridge and weak tea. Her fingers trembled so badly she nearly dropped a cup. At last she balanced the heavy tray and turned toward the door. She paused, glancing back once more at the woman, but the woman had already turned away again, shoulders tense, knife moving without pause. Clara stepped into the hallway, the tray pressing into her arms, each step toward the East Hall feeling heavier than the last. The East Hall was long and narrow, lined with heavy wooden benches and pale gray walls. Sparse light slipped through small barred windows high above, casting broken shadows across the floor. Clara stepped inside cautiously, the tray trembling in her grip. A line of patients sat silently along the benches. They were older, most of them thin and hunched, their eyes unfocused or fixed on the ground. A few looked up as she entered, their expressions blank, as if they had already forgotten how to read another human face. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She forced herself forward, setting down each bowl of porridge carefully, her movements mechanical. One of the women, her hands trembling uncontrollably, grabbed Clara's wrist for a moment. Clara nearly dropped the tray, her eyes wide. The woman's fingers were icy, her nails yellowed and cracked. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Her eyes darted quickly toward the hallway before she let go, sinking back into her silent stupor. Clara finished serving as quickly as she could, her pulse hammering in her ears. When she placed the last bowl, she stepped back, pressing herself against the wall. She watched them eat, slow, repetitive motions, the porridge spilling down their chins. At the far end of the hall, Mr. Falk appeared without a sound. His presence snapped the air taut. He stood still, watching the patients eat, then shifted his gaze to Clara. Their eyes met. Clara felt her spine lock in place, the tray slipping slightly from her damp fingers. He tilted his head, his expression unreadable, as if waiting for her to flinch. After a long moment, he turned and disappeared back into the corridor, leaving her alone with the silent figures. Clara let out a shaky breath, her knees nearly buckling. She gathered the empty cups and bowls, each clink echoing sharply. When she turned to leave, she caught sight of a narrow doorway partly hidden behind a curtain at the end of the hall. A dim light glowed beyond it, and for a moment she thought she saw a shadow move. Her heart thudded painfully. She wanted to step closer, to see what lay behind that curtain, but her body refused to move. The patients watched her, their eyes following her in unison now, as if they all shared a single, silent thought. Clara turned away abruptly, clutching the tray tighter, and hurried into the hallway. The moment the door closed behind her, she pressed her forehead against the cold wooden panel, fighting the urge to cry out. She could still feel the ghost of that woman's fingers on her wrist, a silent plea she couldn't understand. The hallway felt longer than before, the shadows thicker. Clara moved quickly, her steps echoing in the emptiness. She kept her head down, the tray pressed against her chest like a shield. Every door she passed seemed to breathe, as if something inside waited to spill out. Back in the kitchen, the woman was gone. The stove had gone cold, and a thin layer of ash settled in the pot. Clara set the tray on the counter, her fingers numb from gripping it too tightly. She glanced around, half expecting Mr. Falk to appear behind her. A sudden noise made her jump, a muffled thud from upstairs followed by hurried, shuffling steps. She turned toward the sound, heart pounding. The corridor leading to the staircase seemed to darken before her eyes. For a moment, Clara's mind screamed to run back to her room and hide under the thin blanket. But something stronger, a small, desperate spark, pushed her forward. She stepped carefully, her breath sharp in her chest. At the foot of the stairs, she paused. The steps above creaked softly, as if someone was moving carefully, deliberately. Clara placed her hand on the railing, feeling the cold wood beneath her palm. She climbed slowly, each step a battle against her shaking legs. As she reached the landing, she noticed a faint light spilling from a cracked door down the hallway. The door moved slightly, swaying with each breath of the draft. Clara crept forward, her slippers whispering on the floorboards. She stopped just short of the doorway, pressing herself flat against the wall. Through the narrow gap, she saw Mr. Falk's figure, tall, rigid, his back to her. He stood over a small makeshift table covered in papers and faded photographs. His hands moved quickly, sorting and folding as if hiding something. Clara strained her neck, trying to see more. Suddenly, his head snapped up. For a terrifying second, she thought he had seen her. Her breath lodged in her throat, her fingers clawing at the wall for support. But he turned away again, continuing his task. Clara stepped back, careful not to let the floorboards creak. She turned and nearly stumbled down the stairs, her vision tunneling. She didn't stop until she reached her room. Slamming the door softly behind her, she pressed her back against it, her chest heaving. Her mind raced. What was he hiding? What was on those papers? The thin walls offered no answers, only the echo of her own shallow breaths and the growing certainty that she had seen something she was never meant to see. Clara barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mr. Falk's rigid silhouette bending over the papers, felt the cold draft of the hallway against her skin. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed of locked doors and pale hands reaching from the darkness. Before dawn, she forced herself out of bed. Her body felt heavy, her thoughts a tangle of fear and restless questions. She splashed her face at the basin, the icy water shocking her back into focus. In the hallway, the hospice was eerily silent. Even the creaks of the old floorboards seemed to have vanished. Clara slipped down toward the kitchen, hoping to find the woman from before, to seek even a small comfort in her quiet presence. But the kitchen was empty, the stove cold again, the knife she had used still lying on the table as if waiting. Clara's fingers hovered over it before she turned away. She moved to the east hall to gather the trays from the patients. When she entered, most of them sat as before, motionless, blank-eyed. But today, one old man watched her with sharpness she hadn't seen before. His gaze followed her every movement, narrow and suspicious. She bent to pick up his bowl. Suddenly his bony hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. Clara gasped, almost dropping the bowl. He leaned forward, his mouth close to her ear. His voice was raspy, almost a hiss. "Don't trust him. He keeps us, he keeps us here." Clara's eyes widened. She tried to pull free, but his fingers tightened. "They all tried. No one gets out," he whispered, each word scraping like broken glass. She finally wrenched her arm away, stumbling back. The other patients remained motionless, as if deaf to his words. Clara clutched the bowl to her chest, her pulse wild. Mr. Falk's voice suddenly cut through the air behind her. "What are you doing?" She spun around. He stood in the doorway, his eyes dark and fixed on her. Clara tried to speak, but no words came. Mr. Falk stepped forward, each footfall echoing sharply. He glanced at the old man, then back at her. His expression did not change, but the tension in his shoulders made her want to sink into the floor. "Take the bowls and leave," he ordered. His voice was so calm it felt colder than a shout. Clara nodded frantically, gathering the remaining bowls with trembling hands. She turned and fled, nearly dropping everything as she crossed into the hallway. Back in the kitchen, she set the bowls down, her chest burning from shallow breaths. She looked at her wrist where the old man had held her. Faint red marks were already rising on her skin. Clara pressed her back against the wall, sliding down to the floor. The old man's words echoed relentlessly in her mind. She understood now. Even if she wanted to leave, there would be no help, no escape, only walls, locked doors, and Mr. Falk's watchful eyes. Clara sat on the cold floor for what felt like hours, her breath shallow, her mind replaying the old man's words. Every sound in the corridor now felt sharper, like a knife sliding too close to her skin. When she finally stood, her knees nearly gave out beneath her. She forced herself to move, gathering the bowls, wiping the counter. Her hands shook so badly she dropped a spoon, the metallic clatter slicing through the silence. Later that afternoon, she was ordered to scrub the hallway floors. Mr. Falk stood at the far end, watching without a word. Each time she looked up, his eyes met hers, unblinking, as if weighing every motion she made. While she worked, she noticed a thin line of dust leading toward a door she hadn't seen before. It was small, half hidden by an old cabinet pushed against the wall. Clara's heart thudded painfully. She glanced up. Mr. Falk had turned, his attention on something outside the window. Slowly, she pushed the cabinet just enough to reveal the handle. Her fingers hovered, sweat beading at the back of her neck. She slipped her hand around the cold metal and pulled. The door creaked open an inch. Beyond it, darkness swallowed everything. A sharp, earthy smell drifted out, damp and heavy. A sudden movement made her jerk back. Mr. Falk was turning toward her again. She kicked the cabinet back into place and bent quickly over her bucket, scrubbing harder as if nothing had happened. His footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. Clara's breath stuck in her throat. He stopped beside her, the heavy toe of his boot nearly touching her fingers. She didn't dare look up. Instead, she focused on the floor, her rag moving in small, frantic circles. "You seem distracted," he said, his voice deceptively calm. Clara swallowed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. A long silence followed. Then she felt his hand rest heavily on her shoulder, his fingers cold and firm. She froze, every muscle in her body seizing. "Stay focused," he said softly, almost like a caress. But the thread underneath coiled tightly around her spine. He withdrew his hand and walked away, his footsteps fading down the hall. Clara waited until the last echo died before she dared to breathe again. When she finally looked back at the hidden door, her mind was already turning, piecing together what little courage she had left. There was something behind that door, something she had to see. That night, the hospice fell into its usual cold silence. Clara lay on her narrow bed, her hands clutched tightly around the hidden letter from her aunt. Her thoughts spiraled around the door she had almost opened, the darkness waiting behind it. She forced herself to wait, listening for Mr. Falk's heavy steps patrolling the hallway. Once she heard them fade toward the far end of the building, she slipped from bed. Her bare feet touched the icy floor, sending a shiver up her spine. Clara crept into the hallway, holding her breath with each step. The oil lamps had burned low, leaving only thin orange halos against the walls. She moved like a shadow, past the portraits that seemed to watch her with silent accusation. When she reached the cabinet, she paused, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might echo into the rooms around her. With trembling fingers, she pushed it aside again, revealing the small door. She hesitated, glancing down the corridor to make sure she was alone. Then slowly, she pulled the door open and slipped inside. The air was thick and damp, smelling of earth and old wood. The narrow staircase beyond the door led downward, each step creaking under her weight. She kept one hand on the wall to steady herself, moving deeper into the dark. At the bottom, she found a small stone cellar. Wooden crates and broken furniture were piled along the walls. In the center stood a large table covered with rags, rusted tools, and thick leather straps. A single lantern flickered weakly, casting warped shadows. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, her eyes darting over the objects. Among them, she saw scraps of cloth, a torn sleeve, a piece of ribbon, a single worn shoe. She reached for the ribbon, lifting it slowly. It was stained, frayed at the edges. Her fingers trembled as she realized it must have belonged to someone before her, someone who never left. A sudden noise behind her, the creak of the cellar door opening, froze her in place. Mr. Falk's silhouette filled the stairway, the lantern light glinting off his eyes. Clara's chest seized, her mind screaming to run, but her body wouldn't move. He stepped forward slowly, each footstep deliberate, echoing off the stone walls. His face was a blank mask, but his eyes burned with cold fury. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, each word curling into the air like poison. Clara dropped the ribbon, stumbling back. The cellar seemed to shrink around her, the walls pressing closer with each second. Mr. Falk reached the bottom step, towering above her now. The straps on the table looked suddenly alive, waiting. Clara's fingers scraped against the cold floor, her breath a sharp, shallow gasp. She realized too late that this was no ordinary punishment. Tonight, he would make sure she never tried to uncover the truth again. Clara's back hit the stone wall, the shock jolting her fully awake. Mr. Falk stood only a few steps away now, his shadow long and distorted by the lantern's glow. The cellar felt colder, each breath scraping her throat. He didn't speak again. Instead, he stepped toward the table, his fingers brushing the leather straps as if choosing which to use. The sound of the stiff leather moving made Clara's stomach twist violently. She lunged for the staircase, but Mr. Falk moved faster than she imagined possible. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with a crushing force. She cried out, twisting, but he yanked her back, forcing her to the center of the room. Her free hand clawed at his arm, her nails digging into his skin, but he didn't even flinch. His face remained calm, almost bored as he pulled her closer. "You don't learn," he murmured, tightening his grip. "You're just like the others." Clara's mind flashed to the torn ribbon, the shoe, the echoes of those who had been here before. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her vision blurring with panic. With sudden strength, she kicked at his leg. The movement surprised him enough that his grip loosened, and she slipped sideways, stumbling toward the crates piled in the corner. She grabbed a broken chair leg, her fingers closing around the rough wood. When he lunged for her again, she swung wildly. The wood connected with his shoulder, a hollow crack echoing in the cellar. Mr. Falk recoiled, his eyes narrowing, the calm mask slipping for the first time. His lips pulled back into something that might have been a snarl. Clara didn't wait. She darted past him, nearly tripping over the scattered tools. Her feet found the first stair, and she hauled herself upward, each step a battle against the heavy, dragging weight of her fear. Behind her, she heard him curse, the sound low and dangerous. She dared not look back. At the top, she burst into the hallway, her lungs burning. She slammed the hidden door shut, shoving the cabinet back into place. Her hands shook so badly she nearly knocked it over. She leaned against it, listening. Heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs, but for a moment silence reigned. Clara pushed away from the door, stumbling down the hall. Her mind raced. She had seen what he truly was. There would be no more warnings, no more punishments meant to scare. Next time, he would finish it. Her bare feet slapped against the floor as she turned toward her room. The walls seemed to close in, the portrait's eyes following her, empty and endless. She slammed the door behind her, throwing the flimsy lock into place. Collapsing onto her bed, she pressed her hands to her face, trying to muffle the sobs that tore from her chest. There would be no sleep tonight. Only the pounding certainty that the next chance she got, she would have to run, or die trying. Clara sat on the edge of her bed until the first pale light seeped through the small barred window. Her fingers ached from clenching the thin blanket all night. her body trembling with each passing hour. Every creak in the hallway felt like a footstep approaching her door. When she finally rose, her legs threatened to give way beneath her. She washed quickly in the cold basin, her reflection in the water blurred and alien. The bruises on her wrist were dark now, wrapping around her skin like a mark of ownership. She dressed slowly, her mind replaying each moment in the cellar. The straps, the scraps of cloth, his hand on her wrist. She could still feel the damp earth pressing against her back. A sudden knock on the door snapped her head up. She froze. Another knock, louder this time. Before she could react, the door swung open. Mr. Falk stood in the doorway. His expression was as still and smooth as marble, no trace of last night's rage visible on his face. His eyes swept over her room before settling on her. "Come," he said flatly. Clara hesitated, her mouth dry, but she forced herself to move. Each step felt like walking into an open grave. He led her down the corridor, past the kitchen, past the east hall. They moved deeper into the hospice, into a wing she had never seen before. The air grew colder and the walls narrowed, pressing in on either side. They stopped in front of a heavy wooden door with thick iron hinges. Mr. Falk unlocked it with a large rusted key. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow storage room, lined with shelves of old linen and crates. Clara's heart pounded as he stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. She hesitated, her foot hovering over the threshold. "Inside," he repeated, his voice lower now, a dangerous edge beneath the calm. Clara stepped in. The moment she crossed the line, he slammed the door shut behind her. The lock clicked loudly, echoing in the confined space. Darkness swallowed her. She pressed her hands against the rough wood, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. She pushed, then banged her fists, but the door didn't budge. She turned, groping blindly in the blackness. Her fingers brushed the cold shelves, the coarse linen scratching her skin. She sank to the floor, curling into herself, her mind spiraling. In that suffocating dark, she remembered the old man's words, "No one gets out." She saw the woman in the kitchen, her hollow eyes, the torn ribbon on the cellar table. A single thought rose above the panic. This was no longer a warning. This was the beginning of her end if she didn't act soon. Somewhere beyond the door, she heard Mr. Falk's footsteps fade, leaving her alone with her terror and the echo of his final quiet victory. Hours crawled by in the dark. Clara's knees ached against the hard floor, her back pressed into the cold crates behind her. Her breathing came in shallow bursts, every small sound amplified in the suffocating blackness. She didn't know how long she had been there, only that her body had started to tremble uncontrollably, her fingers numb from gripping the edge of her skirt. Then, faintly, she heard something, a careful rustle at the door. She pressed herself closer to the shelves, her heart hammering so loudly she thought it might give her away. A small click, the sound of metal against metal. Slowly the door creaked open just a fraction, letting in a thin blade of gray light. A hand slipped through, holding an old iron key. Clara's eyes widened. She crawled forward, reaching for the hand. In the dim light she recognized the cook, the older woman from the kitchen, her face pale and drawn. Their eyes met for a brief electric moment. The woman did not speak. Instead, she pressed a trembling finger to her lips, then gestured for Clara to take the key. Clara's fingers closed around the cold iron, her breath catching in her throat. The woman glanced over her shoulder, her shoulders tense, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. She leaned closer, her voice a thin whisper almost lost in the dark. "You must go tonight. He will not forgive." Clara nodded, unable to form words. The cook's eyes flickered again toward the corridor before she slipped away, the door closing softly behind her. Clara knelt there for a long moment, clutching the key so tightly it dug into her palm. Tears spilled down her cheeks, from relief, fear, and the sudden, fragile hope that flared inside her chest. When she finally stood, her legs shook violently. She tested the key in the lock. It turned with a low groan, the mechanism grinding as if unused for years. She pulled the door open and peered into the hallway. It lay empty, silent. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch her, their blank eyes waiting. Clara slipped out, moving like a ghost. Each step felt too loud, too heavy. She glanced toward the kitchen but saw no sign of the cook. She was alone again, but this time with a sliver of power clenched in her fist. She hurried back to her room, her mind already mapping every hallway, every turn, replaying every crack in the floor she had memorized. Clara closed her door softly behind her, pressing her back to it as she slid to the floor. She opened her hand and stared at the key, its weight both terrifying and precious. Tonight, she would run, and no matter the cost, she would not stop. The day passed like a slow, choking fog. Clara performed her chores mechanically, her mind elsewhere. Her fingers fumbled as she washed bowls and swept floors. She moved through the halls as if underwater. Mr. Falk watched her closely. His eyes followed every motion, sharp and calculating. Once he stopped her in the hallway, his hand curling lightly around her upper arm. "You seem distant," he said, his voice low, almost amused. Clara forced a small nod, avoiding his gaze. Her heart slammed so loudly in her ears that she feared he might hear it too. That night, she returned to her room early. She sat on her narrow bed, the key hidden beneath her thin mattress. She listened to the house, the distant clink of kitchen pots, the slow steps of Mr. Falk as he moved through the halls, checking every door, every lock. Outside her small window, the forest was a wall of black, fog curling between the trees like restless spirits. Clara pulled the key out, turning it over in her trembling hands. Her mind replayed the cook's whisper. "Tonight, he will not forgive." She packed silently. A thin wool scarf, her aunt's letter, the small tin comb, nothing else. Each object felt heavier than iron. As the lamps in the hallway finally dimmed and Mr. Falk's steps grew fainter, she rose. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the key twice before she reached the door. She eased it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. She froze, listening. Nothing, only the echo of her breath. Clara slipped into the hallway. The portraits on the walls loomed in the dark, their faces twisted in long shadows. She moved carefully, every board beneath her feet threatening to betray her. At the end of the hall, she turned toward the hidden door she had discovered days before, the one that led to the cellar. But tonight, she passed it. She had memorized another way, a narrow servants' corridor that snaked behind the kitchens and led toward the outer gate. She reached it, her fingers groping along the wall until they found the seam of the hidden panel. She pushed it open and ducked inside. The passage was tighter than she remembered, the smell of old wood and mold overwhelming. Her breath shivered in her chest as she crept forward, fingers brushing the walls to guide her. Each step felt like crossing a thin sheet of ice threatening to crack beneath her at any moment. Finally, she saw it. The faint glimmer of moonlight leaking through the cracks of the outer gate. Clara pressed her palm to her chest, steadying her pounding heart. She stepped closer, the key gripped so tightly her nails cut into her skin. This was her moment. There would be no second chance. Clara stood just steps away from the gate. The moonlight painted thin silver lines across the ground, breaking through gaps in the wood. She reached for the heavy lock, her fingers fumbling as she tried to fit the iron key. Her breath rattled in her throat. Each second felt like an hour. Finally, the key slid into place. She twisted it, feeling the old mechanism grind, resisting her desperation. A sharp click echoed, louder than a gunshot in the silent night. Clara froze. Behind her, the echo of footsteps shattered the quiet. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. She spun around. Mr. Falk stood at the end of the passage, the moonlight catching the edges of his black coat. His face was a mask of rage and satisfaction intertwined, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. "Did you really think," he called out softly, "that you could leave?" Clara's pulse surged so violently she thought she might collapse. Her fingers scrabbled at the lock, trying to slide the gate open. It stuck, heavy from years of neglect. Mr. Falk stepped forward. Each movement was measured, almost casual, as though he were walking toward a misbehaving child. "All of them thought they could run," he continued, his voice echoing between the narrow walls. But none of them understood. Clara forced her shoulder into the gate, pushing with all her strength. It shifted an inch. Another footstep behind her. She turned just in time to see him lunge forward, his arms swinging out to grab her. Instinct took over. She ducked, feeling his hand graze her hair. She shoved the gate again. It groaned and opened just enough for her to squeeze through. She stumbled into the icy night air, the forest stretching ahead like a black sea. Behind her, Mr. Falk crashed against the gate, his shout tearing through the fog. Clara ran. Branches slapped against her face and arms, her breath tearing from her lungs in ragged bursts. The cold sliced her skin, but she didn't stop. She heard him following, crashing through the undergrowth, calling her name, a sickening mix of fury and command. Clara's feet caught on roots and rocks, sending her sprawling, but she scrambled up again, her hands clawing at the wet earth. Her only thought pulsed through her mind. Keep going! Don't stop! A sudden clearing appeared ahead, moonlight pouring down onto an open slope. Clara forced her aching legs to move faster, bursting into the light. She looked back only once. In the darkness at the edge of the trees, she saw his shape, still coming, relentless, unstoppable. Clara turned forward again, her heart burning. She didn't know where the path led, but she knew if she stopped now, she would never see another dawn. Clara ran until her legs threatened to buckle beneath her. The forest seemed alive, branches snatching at her arms, roots clawing at her feet. Her breath tore from her throat in ragged gasps, each one a struggle against the freezing night air. Behind her, she heard Mr. Falk crashing through the undergrowth, his curses echoing between the trees. Every time she thought she had gained distance, his voice would cut through the fog, closer than before. She stumbled forward, her hands outstretched to push away the branches. Blood oozed from shallow cuts on her arms and face, her dress torn and heavy with dew. The moon guided her only in fragments, slipping behind clouds and trees, leaving her in sudden pockets of darkness. She burst into another clearing, falling to her knees. The ground was soft with wet moss, and for a moment she thought she might not rise again. Her fingers dug into the earth, her chest heaving. Then she heard him. Closer now, the sound of snapping branches and labored breath. Clara's eyes darted around the clearing until she saw a narrow animal trail slipping deeper into the trees. She forced herself up, her muscles screaming. She stumbled down the trail, her feet barely finding purchase on the slick ground. The path twisted sharply, forcing her to lean against trunks, slipping and dragging herself forward. She reached a small ridge and looked back. In the faint moonlight, she saw him enter the clearing, his silhouette towering and unmistakable. He paused, scanning the trees, his head turning slowly. Clara ducked behind a fallen log, her hand pressed over her mouth to muffle her ragged breathing. She watched as Mr. Falk moved across the clearing, each step careful, listening. Her heart slammed against her ribs so violently she felt dizzy. She fought the urge to sob, to collapse completely into the mud. After what felt like an eternity, he turned, stepping toward the far edge of the clearing, disappearing behind a thick line of pines. Clara waited, counting her breaths. 1, 2, 10. When the forest finally fell silent, she crawled out from behind the log. Her legs shook so violently she almost collapsed again. She stumbled forward, her mind burning with one word: go. Through the trees, she saw a thin glimmer, a faint light in the distance, a possible sign of a road or a village. Hope flared through her, fragile and desperate. She forced her feet to move, ignoring the throbbing pain in her muscles and the cold seeping through her torn dress. The forest around her seemed to close in, but she kept going, one step at a time. Tonight she had slipped from his grasp. But she knew he was still out there, somewhere behind her, hunting, and if she stopped now, there would be no second chance. Clara stumbled through the last line of trees, her arms outstretched as if she might fall forward and never rise again. The forest finally thinned, revealing a narrow dirt path winding down into the valley below. Far ahead, she saw the faint outline of rooftops, a village half hidden by morning mist. Pale smoke rose from chimneys, curling into the gray sky. It felt impossibly far, yet closer than any dream she had dared to hold these past days. Her breath rattled in her chest, each inhale cutting like broken glass. Her feet slipped on the damp slope, sending her crashing into the mud more than once, but she kept crawling forward, her fingers clawing at stones and moss. Behind her the forest stood silent now, watching. She felt its weight pressing at her back, the echo of Mr. Falk's voice still gnawing at the edge of her thoughts. Every snap of a twig or distant bird call made her flinch, her mind bracing for the feeling of a hand on her shoulder. She reached the lower edge of the trail just as the first rays of dawn spilled over the hills. The light struck her face, blinding and raw, but she didn't turn away. Tears welled in her eyes, mixing with the dirt and blood on her cheeks. Her legs gave out completely. She collapsed at the edge of a small pasture, her body folding into the wet grass. Her chest heaved, pulling in great shaking gulps of air. A distant bark rang out. She turned her head weakly and saw a dog running toward her from the edge of the village. Moments later, a figure appeared behind it, a farmer squinting into the early light. Clara tried to call out, but only a hoarse croak left her throat. She raised one trembling hand. The farmer's eyes widened, and he broke into a run. When he reached her, she saw the shock and confusion on his face as he knelt beside her. The dog sniffed at her feet, whining softly. Clara tried to form words, but they dissolved into choked sobs. The man lifted her carefully, his arms strong and warm. She let her head fall against his shoulder, her entire body going limp at last. As he carried her toward the village, Clara's gaze drifted back to the dark line of the forest. In that moment, she knew she had escaped the hospice, but not the shadows it had left inside her. There would be no true freedom, only survival, and the heavy, permanent ache of memory she would carry pressed deep into her bones. But for now she had crossed the threshold. She was alive, and that, for this fragile morning, was enough.